Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at Chapter 5 from African American Studies. The chapter is titled The Field and Function of Africana Studies, Insights from the Life and Writings of W.E.B. Du Bois. In terms of how to say his name, it's DuBois or DuBois. I think DuBois is more common here in the U.S., but DuBois is more of a French pronunciation. So I'll probably just say DuBois. So this chapter is really a very interesting one and a very powerful one because you are getting a very deep critical insight in terms of how Du Bois's writings and contributions affected the field of Africana studies, Black studies, African American studies. He was just so prolific. He did so much in the time period in which he lived. And then, of course, today, his works are still continue to be just really important and in lots of fields of studies. So not just an ethnic studies, Black studies discipline, but in sociology. You might read him in an English class or in a psychology course. Just really powerful. So in terms of what you should be getting out of this chapter when you read it, is really captured in the introduction on page 53. So it says here that Du Bois outlines a broad vision of the role of Black colleges in promoting Black liberation that is equally appropriate for envisioning a necessary trajectory for Africana studies in the 21st century. This chapter summarizes Du Bois's many contributions to Africana studies, focusing on 10 themes found in his writings. And so it's really, when you consider the field and the discipline, what are you learning here in a Black Studies course? It's really about that Black liberation. It's really about empowerment, Black empowerment. It's Black knowledge. It's dismantling white supremacist structures of power that can often relegate these knowledges to the sidelines or the margins rather than putting them in the center where they belong because of how influential the work is. And of course, it's about disruption. Black studies from its very origins at San Francisco State was about disruption and dismantling the structures that prevented a certain type of education from being a part of academia and higher education. So as you read this chapter, it starts off with this really great summary of the life of Du Bois. And you can see his education. They highlight that in the first paragraph on page 53 underneath that section, the life of W.E.B. Du Bois. He just had an amazing background in education and all these opportunities and where he worked and his involvements with the NAACP. And then, of course, the first Pan-African Conference, his international work, and of course, going to Ghana in 1963, prior to when he dies that year, to help with the Encyclopedia Africana. And so, if you have never read anything really about Du Bois, this is a great intro for a little bit about his life. You might be inspired to read something by him or to just do some additional research after this little mini bio prior to getting into the thematics in terms of what he was writing about and how it relates to our field of study. So the first category that the author James Stewart talks about is notions of race and culture. And so he had a maybe not as popular idea about race and culture when he was alive. And I know that it created some tensions between other African American scholars of the time period, like Booker T. Washington. But on page 55, the author gives you a great summary about what Du Bois meant regarding race and culture. And I think his quote, and by his quote, I mean Du Bois's quote that is in the center of page 55, has a good, clear definition of what he means by race. So, at all times, however, they have divided human beings into races, which, while they perhaps transcend scientific definition, are clearly defined to the eye of the historian and the sociologist. What then is race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. And so what you should be grasping from this quote by Du Bois is that there is a systemic structures. There are systemic structures in place that continuously divide humans into these race categories. And whether, people want to be divided racially or not, there are very specific lived experiences that occur when you are read racially by others. And so, in terms of his definition of race, he's really talking about how, and it relates back to the chapter 4 prior to this one, the notion of Pan-Africanism. There's this general commonality across all people who identify a certain way racially, and they're all striving towards a certain end. And he calls that the ideals of life, right? And so they talk a little bit in that section about how, in the end, Du Bois's real definition about race is a cultural definition about race. It's the similarities across groups that kind of pull us together. And then the next section, and there's quite a few sections, and I highlighted a lot in all of them. So I'm going to try to go through them a little faster for you, and then you can always reach out via email with additional questions if there was a section that you need more information about. So in terms of the identity dynamics among African Americans, I did a lot of work on Du Bois's scholarship writing about double consciousness. And as a master's student, I actually worked on a notion of multiple consciousness that moved out of that duality that Du Bois talks about here. But I think that it is so key to understand what that means and how it relates to the field of Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, and beyond that, because it encompasses the other ethnic studies disciplines. It's this notion that you are always, and it's described with his own words on page 56, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And so this notion of double consciousness can actually be very much felt or maybe you might find difficulty explaining it, but of belonging and almost not belonging. So for instance, when I consider myself, how others look at me and read me versus how I read myself. And so part of that is the white privilege, when someone can look at me and not tell racially that I identify on my Mexican side. I'm Mexican American, right? And so there's this intense warring within one's body of not being enough and always looking almost like an outsider in. And I do think that it's very well described in this section in terms of, for instance, having to assimilate or conform to a Western form of education, like Du Bois ended up doing, and what those Western values are and how they are very white, and then how that made one feel about his Black culture and his Black knowledge, and this warring duality within himself, in which you are struggling not to look at a portion of who you are with contempt, because that is what society and systemic forces have always instilled in you. And I think a really good example of double consciousness is if you think of the doll test that occurred in order for Brown v. Board of Education as the evidence that separate was not equal. And so when the Black children were looking at the dolls, they knew to pick the white dolls as the beautiful and good dolls because of that double consciousness, the ingrained outsider or negative feelings that you internalize about yourself based on the dominant messages you're receiving from society around you. So the children were learning that they weren't as good as those white babies. And so that came out in the test. And that is a very good example of this double consciousness, this warring that can occur in one's self. And it's very particular to people of color. So I think that's a really powerful, really important section and theme of his writing that carries over into a lot of work that we do in Black Studies. And so as we move forward with some of these other sections, the folk culture, elite culture, and creative production section that goes from 56 to 57 is almost the response to that double consciousness. So now you have to privilege these forms of productions that are coming from Black authors, Black artists, the Black aesthetics. It's time to bring this culture, bring this creative production and acknowledge it for the beautiful contributions and important contributions that they have always been. And so it's coming into the center of study and analysis. The social research methodologies section that talks a little bit more about Du Bois's work as a historian and as a sociologist, and that those were kind of his fields that he was trained in, and how even within those fields he pushes back against maybe the standards or the canonical practices. And when I say canonical or canon, it means the foundations for a discipline. You usually never question the foundations for a discipline, but Du Bois is questioning it all. And part of it is that history. And so there's good discussion on page 58 about how history was limited because the common folks' history was not captured in what he was reading and studying. Because not that it didn't exist, but because it wasn't considered valuable enough to capture. And so he does this writing and synthesis in which he is working historically, but also fictionally. And so it's a blending of like historical fiction. And this relates back to the interview with Danny Glover from chapter 2 and the notions of oral histories and their value. And so if you end up fusing fiction, and you say fiction in quotes, because it might actually not be fiction, because these stories could have been passed down from generation to generation within your family, and you know that they happened, but maybe the facts change with each telling a little bit, but it wasn't captured in the historical writings of the time period. And yet you use what you were shared as oral histories, as oral stories, as part of your facts, your historical evidences. Does that equate any less than a history textbook? And when you consider that, and when you consider what it means to have facts, who writes the textbooks? That is always the question. So if the winners of history, those who win the wars, write the textbooks about the wars, are you getting a full perspective of what actually occurred? And if the losing side has a book about what happened, how much different would they be if you read them simultaneously? So there's a lot of things to consider here in what DuBois was doing with synthesizing history and fiction in some of his works, because he wrote all different types of writings. He had the academic, he has plays, he has stories, all different types, poems. And is one privileged over another? Should it be? We move on to page 59 about education, educational institutions. This is where the author talks about DuBois's pointing out that Black institutions have a responsibility for a certain type of program of instruction that's going to foster change. And so when you think of historically Black colleges and universities, what is going on there is very different than what goes on in a more white or Eurocentric college. And I mean, some of this, and it's discussed here as well, is DuBois's own experiences at some of the, quote, Ivy League institutions that he attended, right? And what he experienced when he went to those very white dominant colleges and how it can be hostile. So, I mean, there's different kinds of work and support that is being done at a Black institution, and he talks about that in this section, and the author, James Stewart, highlights that as a theme. Then on page 60, you have communicating with non-academic audiences. So this is about the social organizing piece. It's not enough to just be working in academia, reading the textbooks, considering these high theory ideas of double consciousness and Pan-Africanism. What does that all mean to our community around us? How does that knowledge affect the social change that we want to see, in which we have a more equitable and just society? And so this is where DuBois is talking about the rift between theory and practice. And how do we close that rift? How do we create a bridge? And so it talks a little bit about how he was a public intellectual. And what does that mean to be a public intellectual? On page 61, we have leadership and social change, which is, again, about being a public intellectual and how your leadership has to move out of academic circles and into community organizations and community organizing. The gender section from 61 to 62 is a little disappointing, but it's very small And unfortunately, Du Bois still embodied some of the traditional stereotypes about women in his writings, and how women are generally not presented independently outside of their relationship with the men. So it's not, I don't know, it's not surprising. Gender dynamics always seem to be a little different in terms of from a male perspective versus a female scholar's perspective. But there is some interesting mental liberations that occur within his characters that are female characters that doesn't happen with the male characters. And that's discussed a little bit about that kind of power of the mind that he associated, at least with his female characters. Then we have Black families and social organization in Black communities. That starts at the bottom of page 62. I think that this is really powerful because it talks a lot about the organizations that moved Black families outside of the cruelty and the generational effects that happened because of slavery and because of rapes and because of the separations of family. And how do you rectify or heal that generations of hurt that breaks down a family unit in the family system? And I do like that this section focuses a lot on Black churches as a key social organization that helped with Black families. Then we have the Pan-African Liberation and International Political Economy section. And I do feel like we talked a lot about that in the last chapter on Pan-Africanism. And so I think at this point, I always say I'm going to talk less and then I talk more because I get really into the topic. The conclusions here on page 64 and 65 is best framed in Du Bois's own words on page 65. And it's about the cycles of violence and the patterns that continue to repeat. And so with each movement in which positive social change is occurring, and in this case specifically for our Black community, there are cycles that go back and cause steps in the wrong direction. And so, for instance, you can think of, oh, well, slavery is outlawed, but then slavery becomes an issue because of the crimes that occurred with the Jim Crow laws and how you can be arrested for very minor infractions and then you're enslaved, but this time through a prison system, right? And if anyone has seen the documentary 13th, you understand what I'm talking about with that. So how do you stop these cycles of violence? And I believe I highlighted this quote by Du Bois on page 65, and I just said it was beautiful. It's just absolutely beautiful. And this is his final assessment and what the author, James B. Stewart, wants to leave you with. What we can look forward to and what the racial strife in the United States ought to teach us to look forward to is that it is possible to have in this world a variety of cultural patterns, that men can live and work together in tolerance and mutual appreciation, that by vast and spiritual natural selection out of those different cultures may arise in the future a more and more unified culture, but never completely unified, which would express and carry out the cultural possibilities of the mass of men. And so my only disappointment in that statement is, you see, Du Bois is referring to everyone as men. And that's a very common practice in this time period, and it still can be common today, in which the default is, when I say men, I mean all people, but I'm saying men. So that's kind of a little irritating. But what the quote really, what I find the most compelling and beautiful about it is that we don't need to be the same in order to live and work together with tolerance and mutual appreciation. That through our different cultures and our different ways of being, we can actually get unified. And it's a beautiful concept. To me, it's just absolutely beautiful. How can you acknowledge the differences amongst us all and still be unified with those differences? And it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful idea. So I don't have the answer for that, but I'll leave it to you to pose when you consider your own experiences in terms of your racial identifications or your cultural beliefs, and how you share those and or get along with others that hold different beliefs. So as always, if you have any questions, reach out to me via email.